Would you be so kind as to start with an introduction of yourself and how you think of yourself in the world?
Yeah. So I'm an assistant professor at Villanova University. And I've been a geriatric and palliative care nurse practitioner for over a decade. My research characterizes and leverages the strengths of people living with serious illness with a focus on older folks experiencing changes in cognition. Um, Typically, what I mean by that is a change in one or more areas of cognition, things like memory, learning, um, visual changes, social changes. That's more than we'd expect with normal aging. And because of that, it typically requires a care partner or caregiver to support them. But I mentioned my clinical experience because this research topic really came from my clinical work. Because I saw over and over again in the clinic settings that I was in the incredible strengths that people and their families really bring to this experience of living with a life changing illness.
Heard. Um, a thing that has struck me as I get a little older, people really don't seem capable, human beings do not seem capable of tracking their diminishing abilities. That if that was something that we were good at or capable of, I feel like I would have seen a scattering, a smattering of people who are like, you know what, I'm not sure I should keep driving, but that really just does not seem to be within our capabilities. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to see ourselves when we go through these significant changes in an accurate way. And some of that is the slow, gradual changes that happen with aging. And some of that, like in Ian's case, is a sudden change where you're experiencing a change in health that maybe you've never experienced before. So I call this phenomenon of sort of noticing changes spotlighting, which is can be really like a really big spotlight of, oh wow, things really changed, or can be these sort of smaller spotlights that are much harder to notice. We often see ourselves as who we are in our 20s, maybe our 30s, and it's really hard to look in the mirror and say, like, who is this person who's had all these experiences and is now aging, who's in front of me? I think it's really hard to recognize that. But often the people who do recognize it are the people who are around us, whether that's, our children or our spouses or our friends and family. They tend to see it before we do.
And also, my father is about to turn 90, and he will point out that there is a tendency of younger people to condescend, to jump ahead of whatever the trajectory is. And he finds that really insulting. He happens to look very young. He always has. And it seems like a complicated balance.
Yeah, so what you're talking about is ageism, which is one of the isms that we don't talk about as much. I One of the things I say is like on SNL, we've sort of canceled most of the isms except for ageism. They still make a lot of really ageist jokes. And it's one of the last ones to really get called out. And it's really impactful for older adults and how they experience the world and how they see themselves. Sometimes this comes in the form of benevolent ageism, like I'm doing something kind for this older person, like please have my seat on the bus. But that for a person like your dad, he might say, I don't need your seat on the bus. I can stand. I'm fine. And I want to be seen as that person. And it really impacts how people interact with the healthcare system. I think older folks really feel like they're not seen well in the healthcare system, that they're only seen for their deficits and everything that's wrong with them. And often that means that they don't like to go in. which is why in my research I've really taken this strengths based approach to balance some of those that deficit perspective of our healthcare system and make sure that we're seeing people for who they are and what the strengths that they still have that they're bringing to the table.
Having said all that, we're here to talk about Ian's story. Ian is not an older man at this moment, and yet has this crisis, which he has trouble recognizing as what it is. He knows there's something wrong, but of course he's never gone through an experience like this. Neither has his wife. It was, it seemed to me, really a profound act of translation, medical translation, in emergent situation. Um, what struck you about that? What did that make you think about?
Yeah, a few things came to mind as I was listening to their story. I do feel like because this kind of came out of nowhere for Ian, it was such a contrast to how he had been living and experiencing his life prior to this. And I think it was sort of like a lightning bolt spotlight of mortality, of what it means to exist in the world, of your health and what you do and don't take for granted in life. Um, what I loved hearing Ian speak about was his experience of sort of coming back to himself after this experience, albeit a changed version. You know, he talked about walking down the street and saying, like, how can you just be going about your day when I know how wild and precious this one life we have is and how fragile it is. Um, so in my research, I asked people who were experiencing changes in cognition. This may be people who were maybe had had a stroke or have Alzheimer's disease or some other form of dementia. And I asked them to reflect on something called inner strength, which is what you draw on when you're facing challenging circumstances like this. And I wanted to know what that looks like for people who are facing this serious life altering illness. And a huge part of that is facing your own mortality. And Ian, I think, reflected many of the same themes that I found in the interviews that I did with folks, where he said he ultimately came to believe that it'll all work out. In my research, I heard over and over again this phrase, you get through it. You just get through it because you have to. And I'm not saying that that we should leave them alone and say, well, people get through it, so that's fine. I think it's a good moment to say this is a place that people need some support in getting through it, and they don't have to go it alone. Um, in my research, I found that they really leaned on things like optimism. I think Ian said, I'm always finding the positive now. They also focus on what's important in life. Ian reflected, you don't sweat the small stuff anymore. And these are all some of those internal elements of that people draw on as they're going through one of these really life-changing experiences that we all experience as humans, but some of us experience it in this um, very in-your-face kind of way. And when they can reflect on that, it helps us all learn how to live and be better people through it all.
Speaking of caregiving, one of the things that really struck me about the story was the extent to which Sonia gave everything, like dropped everything, and went through this incredibly intense moment with Ian, and yet completely dismisses her own role as a caregiver.
Yes, I noticed this so much, and I really appreciated that you reflected back to her all the work that she was doing. Because, right, I think she said, I don't think I'm made out to be a carer. Like, if I were in the partnership, if one of us was going to be the caregiver, it was probably going to be Ian. And I don't think I have I have it in me. I have to tell you, it was wild to hear her say that out loud because I found the same thing in my research over and over again. Caregivers would say, I'm not the person for this. I'm not cut out for it. I'm worried I won't be good enough. And I think for Sonia, she was experiencing a particularly challenging thing that many people who are carers to people with dementia experience, which is they're losing or afraid of losing the person they love, which is one loss, but also the work and contribution that that person makes in their partnership that they've built all over these many years. And so she's taking on that work also, while managing the emotional work of maybe losing her partner. So she's she's handling a lot, and she handled it so beautifully with a lot of effort that really is very invisible.
And somehow, whilst completely dismissing her work.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did in my research is so I did these interviews and we analyzed them using qualitative methods and specifically this one method called poetic analysis, where we pulled together the words that people spoke in and composed them as a poem. The reason we did it was to help describe these really complex experiences in a more simple way, which I think really happens through the songs here too. And I really appreciated this parallel.
Tell me about the why there, because I'm guessing it does connect with some of this project.
Yeah. So part of the why is twofold. One, I, the work of representing the experiences of people with cognitive impairment in a way that tackles some of the ageism that we talked about, where a regular everyday person can really hear and value their voice, can be challenging when typically what we do in research and qualitative methods is we have this long, beautiful quote, like in the stories that Ian and Sonia told, and people who have changes in their memory and thinking can't always do that. But it doesn't mean that the depth of what they're saying isn't there. It is. It's just maybe represented in smaller chunks or when put together with quotes from across the transcript. It really highlights these deep abstract themes and experiences that they're having in a way that I think can resonate a little bit more for the readers. Um,
So
yeah,
using poetry to refract these sort of shards into a narrative. Is that right?
exactly, exactly. And the other piece is really to pull together, right? Something that is really complex um, in in a way that tells the whole thing in a succinct way, and it kind of cut through it. Um,
And why
so
is that? Why is that important?
I think uh, I think for me it's really important. So as scientists, we often do a lot of work to do the research, but I think where we're challenged is communicating it. And I think we have to be really creative right now in finding ways to connect with people who aren't scientists to share our work. And I think sometimes the humanities is a way that we can do that. So if we can, as scientists, crosswalk that a little bit, it might resonate a little bit more. We can talk to each other as scientists in specific languages and in our papers and our manuscripts, which is kind of our currency. But I really wanted to, with this work, speak a language that might be a little bit easier to translate so that the important work and the effort that these participants did can actually be disseminated out for regular folks. Yeah.
I mean, I of course, am having this conversation, myself with the scientists that I get a chance to talk to. It's something I hear over and over again. Dr. Jennifer McQuiston, former CDC researcher and a veterinarian, was saying the other day that you can write a paper and get it published, and if no one reads it, if no one in the public can parse the language, and I was starting to wonder whether we actually need to bring this very specialized communication skill into the education process, which is to say, yes, you need to know the very specific language of doing an analysis, of doing the research that you're describing. And also, in order to cross the barrier to the non-scientific world, we also need to be having this other completely different and in some ways almost contrary language.
Yeah, you have to do a sort of a translation of it.
And there's no support for that.
There's no support. There are more recently some like PhD programs or science programs will offer science communication training that is more about sharing your message in a clear, concise, impactful way. We also have narrative medicine that specifically in healthcare allows us to reflect some of these complex, challenging things that we experience and share it in poetry, writing that's maybe a little bit more accessible. But I think this is such an important topic, and we really need to think creatively and broadly and outside of the box, and then bring that training back into our education system where we're doing it on purpose rather than this is sort of working out that some people have figured out the code of how to communicate. But we do this all the time as healthcare providers to do this translation of I have a word I know for what Ian experienced, for example. He had a hemorrhagic stroke, but he talks about it as a brain bleed. And if I were in a visit with him, I would use his own language and mirror it back to him because he's going to listen to me saying like, "Oh, you had a hemorrhagic stroke," and it doesn't resonate. So we're
It in
constantly
fact
doing
it in
this.
fact pushes the distance between your narrative and his narrative apart.
Puts this barrier between us that we are not both human and I could have this experience just as well as he could. So I think that I experienced that very much as a clinician. This wall that we like to build with some things like language. Um, and when I became a researcher, I wanted to make sure that we were also building tools that help to bring that down as well to understand, that we're all people in this, you know, big blue ball trying to do the best we can and live the best lives we can. Um,
Yeah, and that empathy is part of the job, from the start.
it is
and
like the
and
part of the job.
well, and it's so it's an impossible ask, it seems to me, that we are making people like you do all of this intense, deep work, requiring doctors to go for days without sleeping, burning out their youth in order to get this prize. And also, by the way, we're giving you it's the way, it's like, I think of it like the lawyers who never get any practice in a courtroom. They've been given all of this classroom experience and then are just sort of thrown in the deep end, and are just not supported in that way. So it does make me wonder about the ways that we are preparing people for these jobs. And of course, I push, I question my own incentives here, because of course this speaks to what I care about. Yeah, like, no, songwriters are like the most important people in the world. And also, it does seem important. Anyway, to get back to where this started, I think you were beginning a story about using the poetics, and what you learned there. Is that right?
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me about the story from Sonia's perspective was this mismatch of her saying that she felt like, I'm not cut out for this caregiving thing, yet she was doing so much work. Part of that is that much of the work of caregiving is invisible and we don't characterize it, what that work is. But this theme, this duality came up in my research. If you don't mind, I have a poem from my research that I think is a really good fit here. If I could read it.
I love that.
Yeah, okay. So it's called A Care Partner's Prayer. And again, these are the words of people who are caring for folks with cognitive impairment. I'm more worried about the future. I'm not the best person for this. I'm so afraid of getting impatient. I get frustrated when I say things 3 times, seeing them struggle, not knowing what the future holds. If I become just the care partner, it's not going to look it's going to look very different than it ever has. And that won't be very good for it. But it might be the price. It might be the price of safety and caring. Please give me the compassion and strength, the patience and the kindness to support them as much as they need. So for me, this poem pulls out this true experience of feeling worried that they're not going to be enough, and knowing that it's what's needed. I think is such a challenging space to be in, and why so many caregivers feel so distressed in this space and need so much support is that our healthcare system as it is depends on them. There's really no one else. And I feel like you can really feel that fear and tension there. And to honor the fact that like caregiving is not going to be everybody's, they're not going to go into it easily. Most people didn't ask for it. It's not like having children where sometimes it's a choice. It's different. It usually happens with a crisis. And I really appreciate being able to honor that sort of like unspoken piece of like I might not really like this, because otherwise it can make people feel really isolated, that they feel like they're bad caregivers because they don't really like it, or they feel like they're not um, suited to it. But many caregivers or care partners can and do learn a lot of these skills, and by identifying the work that they're already doing and giving them support in doing that work, I think we in healthcare can do a better job of supporting our caregivers.
It also strikes me that it contains a contradictory impulse, and perhaps not unlike a scientist being trained in this dense, specific, complicated language, and then also being expected to figure out how to speak to a general audience, through the media of all things, without support. Similarly, all of your time as a caregiver is spent focusing on someone else's needs. And so for Sonia, perhaps, uh, having given all of that up and yet still feeling human, and perhaps not, always feeling as much the center, of course, as Ian. I wonder if she's to some degree shining a light on that contradiction internally.
Yeah, I think duality is something that we struggle with in science, when someone feels both the black and the white at the same time. And it's not gray, it is truly black and white. And our scientific methods are not very good at honoring those dualities, which is why, for me, qualitative methods that do allow people to have both of those experiences in the same intensity and at the same time sometimes was a better fit for these kind of very human experiences that we have. Um, yeah, duality is the space that I like to live in the most, I think.
Heard. So, what was your reaction to Tom's song?
Yeah, I loved this song, and I think I've had it stuck in my head now since I listened to it.
It has some serious brainworms in it.
It really does. Um, One of the things that struck me about the song is that it highlights the nature of caregiving and sort of the subtle way that caregivers help support a person with serious illness in coming back to themselves. Um, Something that's really under recognized is about between 50 and 80% of people with a serious life, potentially life limiting illness have co occurring mental health symptoms. Depression is the most common, but people can also experience these PTSD like symptoms or anxiety. And we tend to focus on both the physical aspects of caregiving and also the physical tasks, or sorry, the physical aspects of illness and the physical tasks of caregiving. But there's this huge component of caregiving that is supporting the mental health and the maintenance of selfhood of this person who had this life shattering experience. And Sonia does that work so beautifully. And I think this line in Tom's song, he sings, I can't find myself, will you? And I think what's really beautiful about it is it's a two-word question, will you? It's so small, but it's so important and it's such a big ask to say like I'm so lost, I need someone else to pull me out of this, and it's really hard for us to ask that. um, and I just think that the way it was composed really highlighted that it's small and enormous at the same time, and that it was repeated over and over, and that absolutely resonated with me.
Lovely. Is there anything else I should have asked you about the story of the song, about your work?
No, I think we covered so much, and this was such a joy to do. I really love this kind of blend of science and art and humanities together to represent the whole human experience that we're all trying to navigate. So I thank you so much for the work that you're doing with this podcast.
Right back at you. Thank you so much for your work.